Hello and welcome to The Daily Space. I am your host, Dr. Pamela Gay.
And I'm your host, Eric Mattis.
And most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science in your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundups. Let's get to it, shall we? Before we begin the annual year in review episode, I wanted to give a quick update on some launches that happened during our break, because everything launches the moment we go on break. There were a total of 9 launch attempts from 6 countries. China was responsible for nearly half of the end-of-year launches, sending off 4 rockets, a Long March 7A, 4C, 2D, and 3B in 3 days. I feel like that was almost but not quite a full house. The other 5 launches originated from Iran, Japan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and French Guiana, with 1 launch each. Iran launched another Symorg rocket with 3 satellites. It almost made it into orbit, reaching a velocity of 7,350 meters per second. From Japan, a H-2A launched the commercial Inmarsat 6 satellite, marking their 3rd launch of the year. A Soyuz 2.1B frigate put another batch of 36 OneWeb satellites into orbit from Baikonur, Kazakhstan. Russia launched the 3rd test flight of the Angara A5. The Percy upper stage, which is a special variant of the Block D upper stage for Angara, well, that rocket failed to restart, stranding the dummy payload in low Earth orbit, nowhere near the geostationary graveyard orbit it was intended to go to. It is expected to re-enter the atmosphere sometime later today, January 5th. From French Guiana, an Ariane 5 launched on Christmas Day, finally, putting the JWST into space. After 15 years of planning, development, and delays, it finally began its 1-month journey to Lagrange Point 2. More on that later. Let's briefly watch the launch and then get on with the rest of the show.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, top.
And we have engine start. And
Allumage
liftoff.
UAP, décollage.
Decollage, liftoff from a tropical rainforest to the edge of time itself. James Webb begins a voyage back to the birth of the universe. Punching a hole through the clouds, 20 seconds into the flight. Good pitch program reported.
Trajectoire est nominale.
Vehicle performance is nominal.
2021 was another rough year for pretty much everyone. In case you missed it, there's a pandemic going on, supply chain issues abound, and there is still a microchip shortage. Despite that, the space industry achieved a lot. There were 145 orbital launch attempts, the most since 1967. Most, 133, were successful. We keep track of orbital launches by launch location, also known as spaceport. Please keep in mind that these numbers do not include suborbital flights such as the Starship tests or New Shepard. The 2021 totals were China 55, USA 45, Kazakhstan 14, Russia 10, French Guiana 7, New Zealand 6, Japan 3, India 2, Iran 2, South Korea 1. Like in 2020, China launched more rockets than anyone else, closely followed by the US. 31 out of 45 US launches were SpaceX launches. 5 of the Falcon 9 boosters launched more times than rockets by several individual countries. In fact, Booster 1060 launched 6 times just last year, matching the total combined number of launches by South Korea, India, and Japan. The smallest rocket launched in 2021 was Astra's Rocket 3.3, and the largest rocket launched was ULA's Delta IV Heavy. From the 133 successful launches, the most ever in a year, 27 humans were put into orbit, as well as 1,778 spacecraft and satellites. Additionally, 16,675 kilograms of cargo were sent to the International Space Station. That's the equivalent of 3 elephants sent to space, to a place the size of an average house, actually. 2 spacecraft left Earth for destinations around the solar system. NASA's Lucy to the Jupiter Trojans and the DART mission to the binary asteroid Didymos. Last year, 989 SpaceX Starlink satellites were launched across 19 different launches, making up almost 60% of all satellite launches in 2021. Since 2019, a total of 1,944 Starlink satellites have been launched, including the Tintin and V0.9 series. As of December 31st, 1,764 are currently functional, with 151 re-entered and 29 more on their way back into the atmosphere. The first shell of the Starlink constellation was finally completed in late May, with nearly 1,600 satellites in 53-degree inclination orbits. After an extended downtime, another several hundred satellites were launched for the 70-degree and 53.2-degree shells. These launches will continue into 2022 and beyond. The final Starlink constellation will eventually consist of over 4,000 satellites. In addition, SpaceX launched 2 small-sat rideshare missions, named Transporter-1 and Transporter-2, in January and June 2021, respectively. Transporter-1 broke the record for most satellites put into orbit on one rocket, with a total of 143 satellites. In comparison, Transporter-2 had a mere 85 satellites. I know that sounds impressive, but keep in mind that most of them were about the size of a shoebox or smaller. A lot of the launches in 2021 were for various satellite constellations. A constellation is a group of satellites put into different orbits which work together for different purposes, like navigation or communications. OneWeb, which is another satellite internet provider, has its constellation much closer to completion than its competitor Starlink. Last year, Russian Soyuz rockets launched 284 more satellites in 7 launches from both the Vostochny and Baikonur cosmodromes, for a total of 394 satellites in orbit, or 60% complete. The European Union's Galileo constellation got one step closer to completion, with 2 more satellite launches in late 2021, satellites 27 and 28. Speaking of satellite navigation constellations, the United States GPS-3 constellation had 1 more satellite launch in 2021. Further satellites were delayed because of the ongoing pandemic. Black Sky Global doubled their constellation of imaging satellites after a series of dedicated launches of Electron rockets and 1 SpaceX rideshare. It's more difficult to keep track of how many of them are in orbit or how many satellites the total constellation will be, but Planet Labs kept launching flocks of their Dove imaging satellites into orbit. 48 on SpaceX's Transporter-1 and 44 on Transporter-2.
There were a lot of satellites launched, but there were also a lot of records set in 2021. Many new space records were set in 2021, most notably the first powered flight on another planet. NASA's Mars Ingenuity helicopter has traveled almost 3 kilometers over the Martian surface during 18 flights and reached a top speed of over 20 knots. Other firsts include the first reuse of a crewed capsule and first flight of a reused capsule on a reused booster on the SpaceX Crew 2 mission. Finally, the first orbital spaceflight with only private citizens on board, Inspiration 4, launched in September. 2021 was the year of Martian arrivals as well. After a roughly 6-month trip, 3 missions that launched in 2020 arrived at Mars. These included NASA's Perseverance rover, the United Arab Emirates Hope orbiter, and China's first Mars orbiter, Tianwen-1, with the lander-rover combo called Zhurong. NASA's Curiosity and Perseverance rovers both drove about 3 kilometers each over the Martian surface during the year. Perseverance, the newer of the two rovers, set the record for the longest drive on a Martian day and the fastest rover on Mars. So far, it has collected 6 samples of rock and atmosphere during its first 10 months on Mars. 2021 was also the year of the space station, with Russia launching 2 new modules to the International Space Station, Nauka and Prichal. Nauka's arrival was exciting, and not in a good way. After it docked with the ISS, the thrusters activated inadvertently, which spun the entire space station 540 degrees on its long axis. Before it could get much worse, the thrusters ran out of propellant and started firing. No astronauts or cosmonauts were harmed during the joyride. The arrival of the Prichal node module was much less stressful. It simply launched and docked without any trouble. In order to make room for Nauka, the Pier module was retired. It was undocked from the station on July 26th and deorbited by a Progress spacecraft to burn up in the atmosphere. This was the first retirement of a permanent ISS module. China launched the first module of their new space station. The launch of Tianhe left the Long March 5B's rocket core stage in orbit to decay uncontrolled. After a few days, it burnt up over the Indian Ocean, fortunately not hitting anyone or anything. Since launch, that station has been visited by 6 astronauts and 2 crewed spacecraft, Shenzhou 12 and 13. It has also hosted 2 uncrewed resupply spacecraft, Tianzhou 2 and 3. Shenzhou 12 tripled the amount of time a Chinese crew spent in space on a single mission with a 90-day flight. Shenzhou 12, currently in orbit, is expected to double that to 180 days in space. From stations that were launched into space to the people that went to space for work or pleasure. But first, let's pause for a commercial break. 48 people went into space in 2021 across 8 orbital and 5 suborbital spaceflights. 21 of those people, one posthumously, were awarded FAA commercial astronaut wings following their flights on U.S. space tourist vehicles. The rest were not eligible because they were either professional astronauts or not Americans. The commercial space tourism industry finally got serious in 2021, with Blue Origin's New Shepard making its first 3 revenue flights. Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two also made several crewed flights, including the first human spaceflight from New Mexico, but is yet to begin regular service. Last year also marked the resumption of tourist flights to the ISS on the Russian Soyuz, now that NASA astronauts have their own ride again. The last tourist to catch a ride on a Soyuz was Canadian Guy Laliberté back in 2009. There were two tourist flights last year. A pair of Russian filmmakers went up in October, and a Japanese billionaire and his assistant in December. 2021 was also a year for setting records. The record for most people in space at one time was broken not once, but twice last year. The first was in September when Inspiration 4, Soyuz MS-18, SpaceX Crew 2, and Shenzhou 12 were in orbit, totaling 14 people for 4 days. The second time was in December when the New Shepard suborbital rocket joined Soyuz MS-19, SpaceX Crew 3, and Shenzhou 13, above the Kármán line, making 19 people in space for about 11 minutes. The record for oldest person in space was also broken twice in 2021, first by 82-year-old Wally Funk in July, and second by 90-year-old William Shatner in October, both on New Shepard flights. 15 spacewalks were conducted by 16 individual astronauts on the 2 active space stations. The spacewalks for the ISS included tasks like adding new solar panels, replacing old batteries, and preparing it for the new modules that arrived last year. The spacewalks for the Chinese space station included the first spacewalk by a Chinese woman, Wang Yaping. Many experiments were conducted on the ISS in 2021. Our favorite experiments last year included sending tardigrades to space deliberately, sending dirty, quote, laundry to be cleaned on the ISS, also deliberately. We couldn't figure out a way to add space concrete to the mix, but NASA did. From new human records to new rockets that will set records in the future. And now let's pause for a commercial break. Several rockets saw their first flights in 2021, and other rockets made it into orbit successfully for the first time. Astra's Rocket 3 made 2 launch attempts in 2021. The first launch in August failed spectacularly when one of the engines shut off at liftoff, resulting in the rocket moving sideways until it had burned enough propellant that it was light enough to go upwards, only to fail later in flight. The next attempt in November 2021 was successful. The American aerospace company Firefly launched their Alpha rocket in early September. Sadly, it was doomed by an engine failure seconds after liftoff. The Alpha flew for a few minutes, but lost control at max Q and was detonated by range safety. In October, South Korea launched their first domestically developed orbital rocket, the KSLV-2. Unfortunately, the third stage shut off early, and it did not reach orbit. Though it's not an orbital launch, we can't not talk about SpaceX's Starship program. SpaceX continued its mid-altitude demonstration program with several launches of vehicles SN9, 10, 11, and 15. Most of these attempts ended in a large explosion, but SN15 landed in one piece and did not explode post-landing. In August 2021, SpaceX stacked the SN20 and Booster 4 vehicles on the orbital launch mount, assembling for the first time what will become the world's largest rocket. This was a proof of concept, as neither stage was flight-worthy, and the vehicle was unstacked the same day. SpaceX still has lots of work to do to be ready for an orbital launch attempt of the Starship vehicle, including finishing the rocket, its launch complex, and getting approval from several U.S. government agencies to conduct the launch. NASA's Space Launch System was finally fully assembled in the Vehicle Assembly Building after the completion of testing on the vehicle's large core stage. Like Starship, SLS also has lots of work to do before launch. It will send NASA's Orion spacecraft out to an orbit around the moon on a 2-week uncrewed mission to demonstrate its fitness for humans. The first crewed launch will take place later this decade. From rockets that launched for the first time to other spacecraft that finally launched in 2021. But first, let's pause for a break. 2021 was also the year for several long-delayed space missions to finally launch. The plan and some hardware from Nauka dates back to 1995. On Christmas Day, the JWST finally left Earth on board one of the last Ariane 5 rockets, much to the annoyance of SciCommers everywhere, who had to wake up ridiculously early to cover the launch. However, it did make for a memorable Christmas morning. The solar panel deployed a little bit earlier than the public timeline suggested, but NASA explained that the observatory was able to stabilize its orientation sooner than expected after separation from the Ariane 5 second stage. As of recording this episode, the spacecraft had completed the process of tensioning its 5-layer sunshield. With the deployment of the sunshield layers completed, most of the single point of failure events are over with. The spacecraft is healthy, and the mirror deployments will come next week. Once the mirrors are deployed, the 18 individual segments of their primary mirror will be carefully aligned with the secondary mirror, which deployed today. It will take about 5 months to finish calibrating the instruments before releasing images that make use of the telescope's full scientific potential. However, we will likely see some calibration images in a few weeks' time. And when they're released, you can learn all about them from us.
This has been The Daily Space. You can find more information on all our stories, including images, at dailyspace.org. As always, we're here thanks to the donations of people like you. If you like our content, please consider joining our Patreon at patreon.com/CosmoQuestX.